The marble heart of Rome beat with the rhythm of conquest. It had swallowed kingdoms whole, bent kings to its will, and carved its name across continents. Here, under the shadow of the Colosseum, the Senate still debated, the legions still marched, and the people still cheered their emperor as if the glory of the Republic had never died. But in the winter of 37 AD, Rome welcomed not a savior, but a storm. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. The soldiers who had cradled him in his father's camps called him Caligula Little Boot, a nickname born from affection, destined to become a curse. At 24, he ascended to the throne of the mightiest empire the world had ever known. And at first, the city rejoiced. He freed the prisoners Tiberius had rotted in exile. He recalled the banished. He opened the imperial coffers, showering Rome in gold and spectacle. Gladiators clashed, chariots thundered, and the amphitheaters roared with life. For a moment, the people believed the golden age had returned. They could not see the shadow moving behind his smile. They could not hear the whisper of something darker coiling in his mind. Because power in Rome was never simply inherited, it was absorbed. It soaked into the bones like wine into stone, leaving behind a stain no virtue could wash away. And in Caligula's veins, that power mixed with something far more dangerous, the belief that he was not a man at all. Soon, he would stand in the Senate dressed as Jupiter himself, demanding worship on bended knees. Soon, his laughter would echo in the arena, long after the blood had stopped spilling. Soon, he would erase the line between God and mortal, turning Rome into a temple where the only sacrifice that mattered was human dignity. This is not the story Rome wanted to remember. This is the story Rome tried to bury. But history has a cruel way of keeping its dead awake. And in the tale of Caligula, the mad god emperor, the dead never truly rest. Part 1. The Beloved Prince. Before he was the tyrant Rome would fear, he was the boy soldiers adored. The legions of the Germanic frontier had marched for years under his father Germanicus, a general so beloved that his name stirred loyalty deeper than any oath. In the cold mist of the camps, among the clang of armor and the smell of wet leather, little Gaius wandered between the tents in miniature military boots and a child-sized cuirass. The men laughed when they saw him. They bent low, ruffling his hair, calling him Caligula Little Boot. To them, he was a mascot of war, the living proof that Rome's future was secure. He learned to march before he could write, to salute before he could pray. And in those days, war was not a lesson in glory. It was a lesson in how easily men died. He was born into the Julio-Claudian dynasty, a bloodline forged in ambition and tempered in betrayal. His great-grandfather Augustus had built the empire with calculated violence. His grandfather Tiberius ruled with a paranoia that strangled Rome's soul. His father Germanicus was the golden heir, too popular, too beloved, dead before his time, poisoned, it was whispered, by those who feared him. Loss came early to Caligula. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, exiled and starved to death. His brothers, Nero and Drusus, imprisoned and murdered. By the time he was a teenager, the family portraits in his life had been replaced by funerary masks. And yet, he survived. Perhaps because he was young, perhaps because he played the part of the harmless dilettante, smiling when others frowned, laughing when others whispered. Tiberius kept him close, raising him in the suffocating air of Capri, a palace of pleasure and poison, watching, always watching. The old emperor once said of him, "I am nursing a viper for the Roman people." It was meant as a warning. In time, it would feel like prophecy. When Tiberius died, smothered in his bed, some claimed, by the very hands of the young man who stood to inherit it all, Caligula was 24, cloaked in the mourning black of a dutiful heir. But in his eyes, Rome saw something else, the spark of a new dawn. The Senate hailed him, the people cheered him, the empire, weary of fear, opened its arms. They did not yet know they were embracing a knife. Part 2. The honeymoon of the empire. For a fleeting moment, it seemed the prophecy was wrong. Caligula stepped onto the Palatine throne like a prince from legend, generous, radiant, almost too good to be true. His first acts were gifts wrapped in hope. Political exiles recalled, prisoners released, the imperial budget laid bare for the public to see. The streets of Rome hummed with celebration, the air thick with the sound of coins clinking into eager hands. To the Praetorian Guard, he gave lavish bonuses, buying loyalty with the gold of his predecessors' frugality. To the people, he gave games, days upon days of chariot races, gladiator duels, and spectacles so extravagant they blurred the line between entertainment and worship. Exotic beasts roared and died beneath the shadow of the amphitheater. Blood pooled in the sand, and Caligula's laughter rolled over the crowd like thunder. It was a strange kind of joy he found there. When the cheers faded, he would linger, eyes fixed on the dark stains left by the dying. Some whispered that he returned alone at night, wandering the empty corridors of the arena as if listening for the echoes of screams still clinging to the stone. Yet to the Senate and the people, these were minor eccentricities. What mattered was that the city was alive again. Construction projects, some begun under Tiberius, others fresh from Caligula's own ambition, sprang up across the capital, employing thousands. The theater of Pompey was restored to its former glory. A new amphitheater rose, glittering with marble and bronze. Foreign envoys returned home with glowing reports. The young emperor was intelligent, articulate, almost disarmingly charming. Rome's enemies were cautious, her allies reassured. And still, in the quiet moments between the cheers, a shadow deepened behind his eyes. The laughter in the games lasted too long. His gaze lingered too hungrily on the wounded. The line between ruler and spectator, between man and God, was already beginning to blur. The honeymoon was short. The sickness was coming. Part 3. The sickness and the descent. 8 months into his reign, the Golden Prince vanished. It began with a fever. No one knew its cause. Some said poison, others divine punishment. His body shook, his skin burned, and for weeks the imperial palace was a mausoleum in waiting. Outside its gates, the people prayed in the torchlight, vowing sacrifices to the gods if their emperor lived. The gods answered, but their gift was cruel. When Caligula rose from his sickbed, he was not the man Rome had loved. His voice had hardened into something jagged, cutting the air like glass. His eyes no longer looked at people, they looked through them, as if searching for something invisible behind their flesh. He spoke of visions, of Jupiter standing at his bedside, of divine commands only he could hear, and he began to act as if these whispers were the only laws worth obeying. The change was not gradual, it was an eruption. Before the illness, Caligula's cruelty was the casual indifference of an aristocrat raised in a brutal world. After, it became hunger. He began designing punishments the way an artist designs sculpture, creative, deliberate, lingering over the details. Death was no longer a sentence. It was a performance. His paranoia bloomed like a cancer. Marcus Junius Silanus, a respected senator, was ordered to commit suicide, not for treason, not for conspiracy, but because the emperor claimed Silanus had appeared threatening in a dream. It became law. If you haunted Caligula's sleep, you might not survive the morning. Then came Drusilla, his sister, his favorite, his lover. He forced her to leave her husband and live at his side, a queen without a crown. To the aristocracy, it was scandal. To Caligula, it was destiny. When Drusilla died suddenly in 38 AD, something inside him cracked. He declared her a goddess. Worship was mandatory. To deny her divinity was treason. The city went into mourning, not by choice but by decree. To laugh, to bathe, to share a meal with family was forbidden. Death was the punishment. Rome was beginning to understand. This was not a ruler who had changed. This was a ruler who had been unmasked. Part 4. The Empire of Lust and Blood. The palace was no longer a seat of government. It was a stage, and Caligula was its only god. He blurred the lines between banquet and brothel, between temple and slaughterhouse. Senators and their wives arrived at imperial feasts dressed in their finest silks, only to leave stripped of dignity, clothing, and often life. He would summon the wives of Rome's nobility to his bedchamber, taking them in full view of their husbands. Sometimes he invited the husbands to watch. Sometimes he invited them to participate. Afterwards, back at the table, he would dissect the experience as though discussing the quality of wine, forcing the men to nod and agree or die. His cruelty was never content with the private humiliation of the powerful. It had to be public, ritualized, theatrical. He called these violations sacred rites, claiming the gods demanded them. Women were made to kneel before him in worship, men forced to perform acts on the emperor himself as if communing with the divine. No one was spared, not even children. Senators' daughters, barely past childhood, were summoned to the palace. Their parents, paralyzed by terror, could only watch, and Caligula made them thank him for the honor. The amphitheater became an extension of his desires. Gladiatorial games now fused violence with sexual degradation. Noblemen were thrown into the arena naked, forced to fight trained gladiators or suffer assaults before the roar of the crowd. When criminals ran short, Caligula simply turned to the audience, selecting entire sections for abuse and execution. Every act was a message. Your body is mine. Your dignity is mine. Your life is mine. It was not enough to kill a man. He had to hollow him first, strip the soul, burn the pride, turn the body into an object, and only then grant death as a final gift. In Caligula's Rome, no one truly lived. They merely waited for their turn on the stage. Part 5. The Ruin of State. Empires are not felled by one blow. They rot from within. By the end of his second year, Caligula had drained the vast surplus left by Tiberius, 2 billion sesterces, into the veins of his excess. Gold flowed into games, banquets, and monuments that served no purpose but to immortalize his ego. When the treasury bled dry, he found new veins to open. Wealthy citizens became prey. A whisper of disloyalty, a vague accusation of insulting the emperor's divinity, and their estates were seized before their bodies were cold. The law became a hunting license, and Caligula, the only hunter, allowed to kill. Taxes multiplied like a fever dream, fees for marriages, for lawsuits, for divorces, for prostitution, for gambling, even for the right to remain silent during his speeches. To breathe in his presence was a taxable privilege. His contempt for the Senate ripened into open mockery. He promised to appoint his beloved horse, Incitatus, as consul. The stallion's stable was marble, its manger ivory, its blankets purple. Whether Caligula meant it as satire or sincerity no longer mattered. The message was clear. The Senate was worth less than a beast. His obsession with grandeur spawned projects as absurd as they were ruinous. He ordered a bridge across the Bay of Naples, over 3 miles of floating platforms, so he could ride across wearing the breastplate of Alexander the Great. Hundreds died building it. He lost interest within days. Even the army became a tool of humiliation. On campaign in Gaul, he lined his legions on the shore, ordered them to collect seashells, and declared them spoils of war against Neptune. Hardened veterans obeyed, knowing disobedience meant death. Rome still looked strong from the outside. Inside, it was hollowing out, its wealth plundered, its leaders disgraced, its soldiers turned into actors in the emperor's theater of madness. And yet, for all his extravagance, Caligula was not done spending. The next currency he would burn was blood. Part 6, The Conspiracy in the Shadows. Fear can bind an empire together, but only until fear turns inward. By 41 AD, even those sworn to protect the emperor began to wonder if killing him was the only way to save Rome. The Praetorian Guard, once the steel shield of the imperial throne, had become instruments of his cruelty, forced to carry out orders that shamed their honor as soldiers. The Senate, humiliated beyond endurance, saw no path back to dignity while Caligula lived. Equestrians, freedmen, even members of the imperial household, each carried scars of his whims. For the first time, enemies in the shadows began speaking to one another. Survival itself became a conspiracy. Among them was Cassius Chaerea, a Praetorian tribune. He had fought for Rome, commanded men in battle, and endured the emperor's mockery like a chain around his neck. Caligula gave him passwords meant to degrade Priapus, Venus, forcing the veteran to repeat them aloud before his troops. The insult was personal. The cause was universal. The breaking point came when Caligula revealed 2 plans, both catastrophic. First, to move permanently to Alexandria, where he could be worshipped as a living god without Rome's resistance. Second, to massacre the entire Senate and replace them with his horse and hand-picked favorites. The conspirators knew they had no time. The longer they waited, the less Rome would remain. The plan was simple, brutal, and precise. They would strike during the Palatine Games when the emperor's schedule was predictable and his guard rotations left him exposed. The chosen killing ground, a narrow underground corridor between the theater and the palace where his Germanic bodyguards could be separated from him. Every step was measured, every man sworn to silence. They were no longer serving the emperor. They were serving Rome, or so they told themselves. The day was set. The blades were ready. All that remained was for Caligula to walk into the shadows. Part 7, The Death of a False God. January 24th, 41 AD, the final day of the Palatine Games. Caligula sat in the theater laughing at scenes of betrayal and assassination, oblivious, or perhaps too arrogant, to see the omen. The performances ended to thunderous applause. The emperor rose, flanked by his praetorian escort, and began the short walk back to the palace for lunch. But instead of taking the main route, he chose the shortcut, the narrow underground passage, the conspirators' killing ground. The corridor swallowed the light. Footsteps echoed on the stone. Then, movement in the shadows. Cassius Chaerea stepped forward. His sword flashed once, biting deep into Caligula's jaw and neck. The emperor staggered back, eyes wide, not with fear, but disbelief. Others surged forward, blades rising and falling in a frenzy years in the making. Steel tore through silk and flesh. Blood slicked the floor. Suetonius says there were 30 wounds in all, each a message, each a debt collected. Caligula tried to speak, choking on his own breath. His final words, "I am still alive," were not defiance, but desperation. The false god clung to his own divinity until the last drop of blood drained from him. When his body hit the stone, the silence was deafening. The god was gone. The man had been dead for years. Above them, the games still roared. The crowd cheered for actors spilling stage blood, not knowing that in the bowels of the palace, real blood had ended an empire's nightmare. But death did not bring peace. Outside the corridor, his Germanic guards raged. The Senate panicked, and the Praetorian Guard fought among themselves. Power had been removed from one hand, but no one knew where it would land. For now, only one truth mattered. Caligula was mortal after all. Part 8. The Legacy of Madness. The corpse of Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, lay cooling in the palace corridor, but the shadow he cast over Rome did not fade with his breath. In the hours after his death, chaos rippled through the city. The Senate debated restoring the Republic, their courage faltering at the thought of the Praetorian Guard's vengeance. The Guard, fractured between loyalty and relief, scoured the palace for survivors of the imperial family. They found Claudius, timid, stammering, hiding behind a curtain, and in an act born more of necessity than conviction, proclaimed him emperor. The reign of terror was over, but the wound was fresh and deep. The Senate moved swiftly to erase Caligula from Rome's memory. Statues smashed, inscriptions chiseled away, his name struck from every official record. Damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory, was Rome's final verdict. They thought that if they buried his name, they could bury the nightmare. But erasure is its own monument. The more desperately they tried to forget, the more impossible it became. Historians would later wrestle with the truth of his madness. Was it illness, brain damage, or the simple corrosion of a soul unbound by law? Whatever the cause, his reign became a warning carved in history that civilization is not a fortress, but a fragile pact between power and restraint. Break that pact, and the veneer of order dissolves overnight. Caligula's Rome learned the hard truth. Absolute power does not just corrupt, it unmakes. It strips away the masks of culture, tradition, and morality, revealing the raw appetite beneath. In the end, Caligula's story is not about Rome alone. It is about the human condition, our temptation to worship strength, our blindness to cruelty when wrapped in pageantry, and the terrible speed with which we can become spectators to our own undoing, the marble heart of Rome would beat again, but it would never beat as innocently.